laws, and allow me here to be a little bit more specific. Which laws exactly? The law that prohibit women from very specific occupations. And those are quite relevant, again, for climate change. Construction is one of these occupations. Second is the expansion of the care services. Care services, in other words, includes preschool services. In, again, our region, we cater to around only 10% of care needs throughout the Arab states. And the third is, of course, an update, and I'm not sure update is the right word or terminology, but let me use it anyway, update of our social norms. Social norms that are challenging women to really thrive and work in all different sort of areas, such as innovative professions in relation to addressing climate change. Now, what this contributes to, the 21% that I alluded to earlier, is a very distinct sort of, I can't find a better word than domestic brain drain, because it's also the region that have one of the highest educational attainments, but on the other hand, one of the lowest labor force participation. So there's a gap here that simply does not make sense. And it leads to two things. One, an unnecessary financial bleed, and we've estimated that for around $575 billion a day. And secondly, of course, coming back to the 21%, is out of 100 women graduating from STEM, 80 are simply not absorbed in the labor market and being part of finding solutions to climate change. But I also want to end on a positive note, because all what I have simply presented to you, colleagues, today is also very well observed in the region, and the region is paying close attention to this, and for that reason, in February 2022, 22 member states came together within the framework of the League of Arab States and the CSW Declaration, and in their very first paragraph, committed to addressing labor force participation of women, particularly because of this reason. And since then, 10 member states have opened up their arms to UN Women and partners to conduct what we would call business plans, i.e. these are roadmaps to accelerate women employment in individual countries such as Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, and in the GCC countries as well. Because if we don't, of course, we will come all the way back to where I started, the 5 degrees Celsius that we expect to see in this region. So these are some of the challenges, but also I'm quite optimistic because we do see some of quite practical solutions ahead and definitely a quite strong commitment. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Susan. Round of applause for Vic and Susan. And I think it's very interesting to see how STEM is actually has picked up a lot in the Arab world compared to other regions. And yet this is not translating enough into women's labor force participation. So certainly some challenges there, but as you said, a lot of potentials. So thank you very much, Susan. And now I would like to ask the representative from UNEP, Mr. Rajiv Garg, from UNEP, UN Climate Technology Center and Network, who will also speak on behalf of Rose Muibaza, the director who unfortunately has sent regrets for not being here. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and I again apologize on behalf of Rose. She's not available because of she's a bit indisposed since today afternoon, and therefore I am making this intervention on behalf of Rose Muibaza, the director of the UN Climate Technology Center and Network. Just to introduce myself, I too work with Rose, and I am the regional manager for the Africa and the CIS region in the UN Climate Technology Center and Network. Colleagues, there are three messages which I would like to point out to you. The first is that triple planetary crisis is a crisis of inequality. It's unequal on the women. We are witnessing three crises: climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, pollution and waste. And each one of them is trying to exacerbate each other. And this is our essential threat. and this is not me, but our Secretary General, which has pointed out that that 3 planetary crises are our #1 threat. And we are in urgent need, and there is an urgent need to come out with an all-out effort to turn things around. And these 3 crises are impacting women and girls, and they are increasing the existing gender inequalities which exist. And therefore, any response to these 3 crises should be a gender-based response. Women are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and biodiversity, and we all know that. And the reasons being the structural gender inequalities and traditional gender norms put women at higher risk by limiting their access to resources and opportunities, compromising their productive roles within household and communities as agriculture producers, as energy providers, managers of water and waste, and impacting their autonomy to make decisions about their own lives. And it is even worse for indigenous women, older women, and women with lower level of education and socio-economic status, who are limited in diversifying their livelihoods in response to climate change. And therefore, means again, the message here is that the triple planetary crisis is an inequality crisis, and the women are impacted the most. Talking about climate change, since we are in this climate change conference, again, the climate change impacts women and gender a lot. And let's see how, what we can do about it and what is happening. The global climate change is proving to be one of the greatest crises humanity has faced, requiring governments, industries, and financial institutions, workers, and communities to rethink on how the world should create and sustain prosperity and livelihoods. Gender-based inequalities are further increased due to the impact of climate change, which affects again women both on a political and a socio-economic level. Due to women's traditional role and reliance on natural resources like water, food, and fuel for cooking, they are not only more vulnerable to changes and shocks in their local environment, but also less likely, for example, to obtain credit to buy drought-resistant crop, means they have to struggle, means they don't have access to it. Moreover, natural resource scarcity, environmental disasters can increase violence against women, and this is a very negative impact of the climate change. Despite the recognition that gender equality is a prerequisite for attaining sustainable development goals, gender inequalities are found in all society with respect to political and socio-economic opportunities. Women continue to be paid at least 20% less than men. And in the informal sector, the women comprises of something like 75 to 90% of the workers, specifically in the informal sector, and are likely to are less likely to be employed if you go out to seek a job, means the male members are preferred more over the female members, and there are statistics to show that. The gender gap is widest in economic sectors that are GHG emissions or that are contributing to the GHG emissions, like energy, transport, construction, certain manufacturing sector. Women also face major barriers in accessing financial services, and only 58% of women in low and middle income countries or economies have an account at a financial institution or a mobile money service provider, compared to 67% of the men. The gender gap and inequalities have been made worse by the COVID-19 crisis, which resulted in heavy job losses in the services sector and the informal economy, where women are largely concentrated on. The third message which we would like to put forward here is that there is an increased need for an enabling regulatory environment to promote a just transition, and gender equality. Gender equality is central to the promise of a green economy, and failure to address underlying barriers to gender equality and inclusion in green economy policy and investment will increase inequalities, contrary to the principle of leaving no one behind. Gender equality should be at the center of recovery efforts and climate action, and gender-responsive policies can address women's socio-economic vulnerabilities and leverage their capacity to drive positive change. Therefore, transformational changes requires laws and policies and action plans that encourage women's participation in green economy and actions that bridge existing gender equalities. Again, a thing to point out here is gender neutral policies and regulations will continue if the women are not in the decision making and policy making processes, and therefore it is a time that we encourage more and more women in the policy making and the decision making or in the decision making jobs. In UNEP and in UNEP we have the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, which was established on 25th November 2021, wherein the Gender Expert Group was created to catalyze collective actions towards gender equality and women's empowerment in the transition to green and low emission economies. The aim of this platform is to build or to create collaboration within various institutions, including civil society and women organization. As the UN Climate Technology Center and Network, wherein we support developing countries access to technologies, we always undertake a study before we recommend a technology. The gender aspects and the gender aspects of the technology are taken into consideration before a decision is made on any specific policy related to technology transfer or the use of any specific technology. I'll stop at that, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A round of applause also for Mr. Gag. We now have, so thank you very much to colleagues from UNEP, UN Women, and from the ILO. We are touching upon three major elements when we talk about just transition: labor, women, and of course the environment. Now, I'd like to know if in the room there are any expectations or burning questions, because then we will move to another set of panelists, and they could try to integrate some of the answers that you might have. So there is a microphone in the room, and if you have any question that is very much related to some of the topics that have already been brought up and that will be expanded, because I think here what was also mentioned by Susan, but also by the other colleagues, is really the how. I think we have the theoretical framework now on, you know, gender equality, just transition, what it means, the different elements that cannot work in silos: labor, environment, the well-being of people, and the well-being of women need to work together, right? So I wonder if there is any question from the floor that could be addressed from some of our panelists. We have representatives from the business world, from the trade unions, from women activist movements. We have lawyers, we have scientists. And so, you know, if you have, we'll take three questions that perhaps can be already integrated in the first round of questions that we are going to propose to our panelists.
Great, and please remember to introduce yourself, and then you can ask
that
your
would
question.
be great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hello, I'm Noor Mohammed. I'm a climate reality leader from the Climate Reality Leadership Project. The question I wanted to ask to the panel is that how can we break the stigma about women in STEM jobs and to enable them in renewable energy? Because as we know, there is a huge stigma, as had been pointed out in the panel, and people generally do not, especially in the Arab world, do not see women in these kind of roles, and how we can also focus on technical and vocational education students, especially when it comes to women, to see how we can break the stigma about them joining the technical and vocational education and then them joining programs related to renewable energies? Yeah, thank you.
Excellent question. So I would like my panelists to
there are more
take
questions.
take into consideration how do we break the stigma when we talk about women in STEM, and I would go a step further. How do we break the stigma of workplaces, STEM workplaces, to make sure that they attract and retain women? So when we do the first round of questions, if some of the panelists can take this into consideration, we'll take 2 more, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Manal Shahadi from ACT Alliance. Basically, I think I'm going to ask the $1 million question that everybody's been wondering, and Mr. Vic, you have addressed it, is that this is my first time at COP, and this is my 2nd week, and it's interesting to see gender and celebrating gender, but as you said, gender shouldn't just be a day, and it should be a cross-cutting theme, and which should be addressed in any negotiating. We shouldn't just have a gender statement. And I'm always wondering, how do we break through this, that it shouldn't be just a statement. We should be, when we're discussing loss and damage and finance and fossil fuel, but this is a barrier, I think, that is maybe, it's not in my ability, but if you have any hints or any wishes of how we could advocate that we are at the center, women and indigenous women and girls in any conversation, not just a sideline in an event that we celebrate, we clap, and then we say, okay, we did our part, we celebrated gender, so we move on. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Another very challenging question that I myself have in my mind. So let's see what we have as an answer from all our experts. And we take a last one for this round.
Hi, my name is Isabel Wisson. I'm from BRAC. So, in the midst of pushing for a just transition, we know the importance of universal social protection systems, and we also know about the importance of including people that are disproportionately excluded, particularly women in extreme poverty. And so I wonder, how do you balance creating universal systems that also intentionally include, target, focus on excluded groups? Thank you.
Another very important question, as social protection is certainly a measure that can help women and men throughout the transition. So that's very, very important. So I think we will start following the program. And I will start, we are actually lucky to start with Tina. Just a second. Yes. With Agustina Morning, who's a Syrian advisor from the International Organization of Employers. And I think the first question was very much relating to the business world and how is the business world also responding to just transition and to take gender equality into consideration, going beyond gender, but looking at it from an intersectional point of view. So also, looking at women with disabilities, indigenous women, as the colleague was mentioned before. So over to you, Tina, for perhaps 3 minutes.
Thank you, Emanuela. And I like the questions that was proposed. It's really deep and powerful because there's obviously a lot of knowledge behind and the reasoning behind the questions. So if you don't mind, Emanuela, I'll probably just, answer my questions rather than, just to make it more relevant. So the first question, thank you very much, is very much to do with stigma and the role of women in society. I think that plays a really, really important role when it comes to policy making, right? Whether it's climate policy, education policy, skills policy, how to get more women into the STEM field. It has a lot to do with how women are viewed as their role in society, and each country is different due to cultural reasons, the way they're brought up, the education systems, historic reasons. There are many factors that come into play, but we saw that IOE, the organization I'm representing, we're the International Organization of Employers, our members, our employer organizations, which is present in more than 140 countries, encompassing 50 million companies, and includes not just multinationals, but small and medium enterprises, they tell us education has a really important role when it comes to addressing stigma. But the problem with education is it takes long for this to, minimized. And we also need to train ourselves because we all should be lifelong learners. I'm a lifelong learner. We all should need to learn how women are being impacted. And the panelists today basically set the stage, the difficulties females face when it comes in the world of work, especially for women entrepreneurs. Women entrepreneurs, they own their own business. They want to get into the sustainability arena. They want to go, they attain green skills. They want to get jobs in the STEM field But the problem is a lot of the women entrepreneurs, they told us that it's very lonely up there. There's no network. They're alone. They're surrounded by males, which is not bad, but it's very difficult for them to go through these barriers. And they find it, most of all, the most difficult thing for them is access to finance. And our colleague from UNEP just highlighted that. When you look at even in the formal economy, where women register their business, they play by the rules, they contribute to the taxation regime, but 70% of formal SMEs owned by women in developing countries are denied access to finance by financial institutions, or they cannot receive the adequate financial services. So, and we spoke to a business lady in Congo. She owns a business. She's a consultant. And she said it's very strange because in her region, she would apply for a loan from the bank, but she's denied the loan. But then her male colleague applied for the same loan, same level of, same field, same expertise, but he got it. So there's a stigma, as you say, with regards to when it comes to access to finance, because perhaps the society or the financial institutions have this preconceived stereotype that a woman is more risky. It's very risky to invest in the women, but the level of skills is equivalent more or less with the level of skills as a male entrepreneur in this case. So we really need to tackle that, and that's in the formal economy. Just imagine if you're in the informal economy. 6 out of 10 people in the working population work in the informal sector. And majority of that, especially when you look at the African continent, is mainly women. They own the informal companies. And due to the difficulties of the bureaucracies of starting your own business, they remain informal. And because of the pandemic, we're seeing more and more evidence that more women own businesses, and also male own businesses. They go more into the informal sector. And that's not sustainable because they don't have the social protection that they need. They don't have access to that. So when it comes to, just to your point about the stigma, it's really a lot to do with the mindset and a lot change of behavior and attitudes. Everyone has a role to play, not just business. Government's also an important role to play. But we are also trying our best to offer platforms. We have a policy working group on gender equality and inequality, and diversity, rather. We also have a mentorship program in collaboration with the EU and Deloitte. We work with the UN training arm, UNITAR, to train more women entrepreneurs with the soft skills, the human social skills that they need. We just launched this week something what we called OGWE, the One Global Women Empowerment on the sidelines of the G20 in Indonesia. So our president, Michelle Parmalee, the first female president of our organization, launched this initiative. So we still have a long way to go in terms of addressing the stigma, but we also need men in the room as well to kind of help us. It can't be just about women talking to women. It has to be a societal approach. And the second question, just quickly, Emanuela, just on the cross-cutting, this is a really big challenge. Gender should be cross-cutting. When it comes to the negotiations, negotiations here at COP27, just for example, I can give an example. Our federation was asking for capacity building because they are part of the loss and damage negotiations, but They want to talk about gender, but they don't necessarily have the expertise on gender. So of course, we'll try to find ways in collaboration with UN agency, including the International Labour Organization, to help find ways in terms of providing training and capacity building, because it is important for all negotiators who do not understand the gender challenges to be aware and informed the challenges that women face, including women entrepreneurs and women in general. And with regards to the last question on social protection, that's a very good question. That's something that we feel very strongly for. It's really important to have sustainable protections. A lot of countries are facing difficulty, especially during the COVID crisis. There is a resolution that was negotiated by tripartite constituents of the ILO, which is workers, governments, and workers, and employers, last year. So perhaps that could provide some kind of key guidance, but we're working very closely with the ILO on that to ensure the sustainability of social protection, to make sure that women who are left behind, especially during the crisis, has the necessary access that they need in order to survive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. And I know that Susan would like to say something, just 1 minute.
Sure. Thank you so much, because it's an extremely important question, a very concrete one, stigma and STEM, right? So stigma, if we look back, what is stigma? It's really perceptions, but there's no facts around it. It's perception about something. So to counterfact that stigma, sorry, you want to show another picture. So in STEM, for example, and those who have heard me before, I usually allude to really, really interesting examples from our own region. We know in March 2021, for example, UAE launched a mission to March, the Planet March, right? And you're nodding, so I'm sure that you know where I'm getting at. 85% of that scientific team were women. But interestingly, that's not only the new generation of women. Egypt, for example, have generations of nuclear physicians born in 1937, such as Samira Musa. Many of you have heard of her. So it's about showcasing all of these brilliant examples that would break that sort of stigma. Of course, Zaha Hadid is another example, a brilliant Iraqi architect who was one of the first in terms of sustainable architecture. So coming back and showing the other picture, in a way, dismantling that perception is a powerful tool in terms of addressing stigmas. But I agree with my colleague also, it's not about women, it's genders. We look also at men, and on yearly basis, UN Women conduct what we call images surveys. Many of you, I'm sure, have read them, that take a look at the perception of also men. And it's interesting because you get a very nuanced picture here. Yes, there is conservative pockets, for sure, but we also know from our latest surveys that more than 50% of men in our region want to spend more time with their children. We just concluded one in Jordan 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago. More than 50% of men in Jordan want paternity leave of 3 weeks or more. So that's, I think, what a powerful tool in terms of addressing stigma is showing the other picture, just to dismantle that perception.
Thank you very much, Susan. I know there are other people that would like to take the floor. I understand that the UN resident coordinator would like to take the floor. Just a couple of minutes, because then I would like to continue with the...
Very briefly,
Yeah.
because I think this reflection needs to be addressed. This was with regard to whether, and that was your question, gender and climate is part of the official negotiations, because that was the question, right? You mentioned that there was a gender day, there were many gender events, but you want to see gender in the negotiation rooms. And I just want to say that gender is part of the formal agenda of UNFCCC. It's part of the convention. It's also part of the Paris Agreement. There is a text in the Paris Agreement and also in the convention which is about gender and climate. So gender is being discussed in the negotiations rooms among the negotiators, and we actually expect that it will make it to the cover decision, of the outcome of this job. So these are the two parallel processes, right? The inside, which is intergovernmental, and gender is present there, and then we have the outside, where with all the partners, we are advocating and trying to push the agenda, forward, including with the thematic days.
Thank you so much for this explanation, and hopefully this will continue to advance also in the future COPs. I'd like to move to a question to Kyra Rees from the Confederation, the Secretary of the Confederation of Trade Unions, the American Trade Unions. And my question to you, as I would like to move the discussion a step forward, is really about to what extent is just transition understood when we talk about sectors that are implied in the just transition? And can we try to go a little bit beyond the traditional understanding of just transition and to embrace a little bit more a lot of other sectors that can also be green and can also create jobs? And I'm thinking more, about the care economy, for instance. So over to you, Kyra.
Hello, thank you very much. I would like to mention about the importance of the concept of just transition for the union workers. I am representing the Trade Union Confederation of America, and for TUCA states that in order to face the climate and environmental crisis, it is necessary to have a structural view. The first thing we have to do to put it in order the discussion of the development model. That's the first thing that we as trade unions are talking about, the change or the discussion about this development model. The current model doesn't respond to the needs of food, education, health system, environmental justice, to have a decent work for all the people, particularly the work classing. We think that this is important to talk about one of the last questions we have about social protection. It is important for us to mention that more than a half of the global population is not covered under any type of social protection scheme, and less than 30% enjoys any type of social protection, comprehensive social protection. Women particularly have a disadvantages in social protection system, experiencing lower coverage rates and substantially lower benefits level. This is one of our fundamental issues about what we think about, just a minute, what we think about of just transition. For just transition for workers has to have inside labor conditions, social protections, and it have to include gender perspective. It is important for us that we have to understand that just transition is not only bringing green jobs. Green jobs have to need decent work. All of the four particular support of decent work: social dialogue, negotiation. We need to have labor's condition, and we need to have the opportunity to participate. When we talk about gender perspective, it's not only others talking about women's. We need to participate as women at all the levels of the discussions. So that is important for us as trade union workers. So for us, we promote 3 pillars of transversal priorities: organization, union, education, and communication. First, in organization, it stands for strengthening and transforming unions to have more participation of women workers. And not only the formal women workers, we have to think about other kind of women that are in informal working. Then we have most to able to see about education. When we are talking about education for our union workers, we are talking about all the levels of education, and we are talking about professional formation. In this professional formation, we need that have the opportunity for women that have to combine cares. And we have to talk about the economy of cares. Finally, we have communication. We need to transform communication, and we start communication talking about what we understand as just transition. We listen here in this COP a lot of different persons and representatives talking about just transition, but the concept is not the same. The concept that we are talking about of just transition have the human being in the center, and in the center it's very related to labor's condition. We have to talk about decent work of any kind of type of work they're talking about, green, blue, any kind of color they want to talk about. We have to talk about decent work. The decent work, what ILO have specified what is decent work. And in that decent work, we need to bring in the gender perspective and a real participation of women in this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing up, for connecting all the different dots when we talk about climate change, just transition, social protection, decent work, that they're all part of the same concept. I'd like to just check if Anne Songole is here. I don't think so. Okay, so I'd like to move to Mr. Chandra Bhushan, President and CEO of International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology, iForest. It would be great to hear from your experience in terms of your organization, which is dedicated to reducing the ecological footprint, and how do you see in India, and how do you see the participation of women in all this process and your experience with that?
Thank you very much. Of all the side events that I will participate in, this is probably the most important but least attended. That's the reality, but I think we should have had more people in this room, because if we are thinking about just transition, then just transition is not possible without transitioning the fundamental difficulty that women face in most of the work environment. And my organization does a lot of work in mining areas, in extractive industry. And we have set up a center called India Just Transition Center, which is looking at just transition in coal mining areas of India. Now, there are certain reality that needs to be understood about the kind of people who work in coal industry. So male work in formal jobs. So if you are looking at well-paid jobs in extractive industry, that largely goes to men. If you are looking at low salary, informal job, that's women's job. And that is universally true in Global South. In fact, male-dominating extractive industry is universally true across the world, but in Global South, women doing the informal work in mining industry. In coal area, for example, you know, the so-called quote-unquote illegal coal picker are women and the children. Now, how do you transition an informal economy, an informal worker, and women is going to be the fundamental issue of just transition. And I heard my colleague from American Trade Union. How do you bring decent job to informal economy is the fundamental question of just transition. Let's not make any bone about it. Okay? There is certain amount of universal safety net that exists for union worker. Okay? That needs to be improved further, obviously. But in Global South, in many countries where economy is 90% informal, how do you define just transition? Now, if we are not able to answer that question, then most of the just transition discussion is we should be discussing outside this conference room. Now, in India, women are at the forefront of environmental struggles simply because they get the most affected by environmental degradation. If you have bad water, degraded land, your forest is cut, the biggest impact is on women. And therefore, historically, environmental struggle in India has been led by women. I would like the same thing to happen in just transition debate as well, where women are leading the informal economy transition that is required for just transition in my part of the world. I just want to answer few questions that were raised, and one that was related to social protection. I think that is the most important question. Just transition for informal sector will require certain amount of social protection that is universally available to everyone. For example, health insurance. The biggest beneficiary of health insurance will be women in my part of the world. Because if a family has money, and if you have a son and a daughter, the family is going to spend that money on protection of health of the male child, not on the female child. So social protection and universal social protection is going to be a very, very important component of just transition. And how do we fund that is again going to be extremely important. Who is going to fund it? Do we depend only on private sector to fund it? Will public funds be sufficient to do it? And that's where I think at COP, the financing mechanism of just transition has to be discussed, especially from the perspective of public fund for social protection, which will be required in developing countries. Now, so social protection without a global collaborative mechanism is not going to be possible, and that many developing countries are struggling with, and they will continue to struggle with. The last question which was there on mainstream issues in all the discussion, the problem is this, and I always give this example that in a room full of men, if gender is being discussed, and with proper knowledge, you will get the gender issues resolved. Okay? But in a room full of women, if you do not have male voice to support you, you will not get the gender issue resolved. And that's what I see in my part of the world. Gender issue is very much restricted to women discussing women issues. Okay? We will have to break that taboo and let men also discuss some of the women issue. I think we will be able to solve mainstream gender issue from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chandra, I think the point made on informality, and we are not going to have just transition unless we address the issue of informality, which connects very well to social protection, is very important. And the other point that you made, which links very well with the next speaker, which is about women leading in just transition and leading in the discussion on climate change. And I'd like to introduce Maria Fernanda Camara Morales, who is an eco-feminist, an activist, a lawyer from Mexico. And the question to you is very much, you identify yourself as an eco-feminist. What does that mean?
Hello, everyone. As you heard, I'm Maria Fernanda Camara Morales, but you call me Maria. It's easier for all. And I'm from Mexico. I'm a young woman activist. I have 22 years old. And yeah, I introduce myself like an ecofeminist activist. And I began my role as an activist for the feminist movement because my country have very important problems and issues around the women's rights. But as I maturate as an activist, I understand that the struggle are linked. So we need linked the struggles to generate better solutions. And I started in the climate action movement to understand how women are affected by the effects of climate change. As an example and personality, this is an example of mine, and it's the example who put me in the ecofeminist movement is the lack of water effect. Girls and women in menstrual period, since the lack of water does not allow, tend to have access to a decent menstruations. And in rural areas in the global south, this is a common problem. Girls don't have water in their schools, so they don't go to schools. This is the solution of their parents. If in your school don't have water, you don't go to school. A report of the United Nations says like 42% of the girls lost classes in the pearl menstruation because they don't have water in their schools. So this is a really problem. And in that sense, I found Las Ecofeminist because this is a movement to put together feminists and the environmental and try to create a quality and healthy work, free from the opposites of the patriarchy, and to put the effects of women in the nature in the center of the debate. Ecofeminists focus on the position that the effects of the climate change affect women the most. Some examples of this position are case of the child forced marriage. In the report published by the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change in June of this year, it's mentioned how in various rural communities in all of the world, due to climate effects, economic resources have decreased enormously. In that way, families sell young daughters to be wives and thus earn incomes. As you can see, these examples are from the real life. These examples affect women and girls, affects human rights, women's rights. So in that way, those effects are caused by climate change. To conclude, if I could summarize ecofeminists in one sentence, I say, no climate justice without justice gender. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask if there is any other question from the floor, since we have a couple of minutes, and I would like to do one round each. We have a question here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nara Muhammad, a climate reality leader as well. I'm her sister. I don't know whether this question is a bit off topic, but I wanted to know how the UN is addressing the scarcity of information when it comes to rural women in developing countries. Because from a personal experience, I was working on a project to try to raise awareness about the gendered impacts of climate change. However, very little information was provided when it came to the context of Egypt. This could be understood, or the empathy, like I could do benchmarking when it comes to other countries, continents, and globalizing, generalizing in general. This could win the female side. However, the male side is a bit more like the empathy and just wants numbers in order to advocate for the topic. And maybe we can reflect on what had been said on having a male voice supporting and advocating for women's needs. So.
Thank you very much. We want to know more about rural women. Any other question? There's one more question, and then I will ask the panelists to no? No, the question was here. It's here. Yeah.
Can I speak in French? Because my English is not so well. Okay, I will try.
Try, otherwise
if
we will.
If not, I will ask help with someone. Thank you. I am Saudata Abubakrin from a pastoralist woman organization from West Africa, Sahel, and also from a feminist platform, a world feminist platform. I have others link here. Okay. Thank you for this information sharing. I like the meeting. It's helpful. So I just want to add some information from our side. I heard someone, excuse me, I forget name, but my sister here in black. Yeah,
Susan.
Okay. Yeah, she talked about stigma. Yeah, that is one of our situation. We face stigma in our territories because there are confusion on insecurity issues and our peoples. It is very crazy issues because we know that it's linked with natural resource. So there is creation of many mistake issues, but it's okay, it's there. And we face serious stigmatization on every way. And this stigmatization affects also our climate, la lutte contre les...
Fight?
Yeah, fight for climate effect. They disturb our traditional knowledge on adaptation, on attenuation, because we know you know that this kind of people, IPs, indigenous peoples, local community, we have a lot of knowledge on that situation. We resist from centuries before this work that we are doing now. So this knowledge, this resistance are too much disturbed.
Yeah.
Too much disturbed. Imagine a lot of us, how many people, millions, we don't know how to work anymore on the issues because we are displaced, we are refugees. And even the person who are there, we have some group of women who are working, who are making restoration des arbres, des forêts. Voilà, reforestation. But now, even our state will tell us, oh, no, don't do something because you are in insecurity. So we are like attached. Voilà. And also our traditional knowledge, how can we practice the traditional knowledge without peace and liberty to do things in our territories, and where we are displaced, we are not in connection with our territories. So for financial issues, nothing. We don't see what is it, what is happening. We don't know. Yeah. We are not informed. We are not linked. So it's a kind of stigmatization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, because part of your question connects with also rural women, and part of the question connects with your knowledge, the importance of the knowledge, traditional knowledge, and how do we use this knowledge to, how do we translate this knowledge into just transition? So very, very good questions. Taking into consideration also the political crisis that affects your territories. So I'd like to ask each one from the panel, perhaps starting from Vic, For one final remark, perhaps picking up on from the different questions, your reflections on this panel and this discussion conversation.
Thank you. And I want to come back to some of the first questions as well, and I'll just be very brief that, you know, if we want to make a difference on a global impact level, we've got to find champions and leaders that are committed from the heart. You know, when you're going to, I come from South Africa, and when we had apartheid and we go to post-apartheid and you say, do you all want to get rid of apartheid? Yes, we do. Do you all want to promote gender? Yes, we do. So you ask for everybody, put up your hands. If you support it, you put up your hands. Because it's intellectually needed for you to put up your hand. You're going to put up your hand. But are you going to do something about it is the question. And so what we're not needing is this intellectual debate of sticking your hand up and just joining the crew to be part of the discussion. We need people who are committed as champions from the heart. And so we've got to infiltrate and find leaders at global level, at national level, and even at the local levels that are committed to the cause of promoting gender. Then we're going to start making a difference. And so the role of those of us here need to go back and find those champions and the decision makers. The second part is the regulatory framework. Government have to put into place regulatory frameworks so that women can get access to finance. They can get access to opportunities. The procurement processes of government need to be refined. That's low-hanging fruit. Those procurement processes can be used to get women into the mainstream of economy. But it needs to be a target that put there, not just a general statement. The last point is the skill side. We need to get the young women at the schools and the education coming out with those skills in the areas that they've been prohibited from before. And then we can start getting the critical mass in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan, very, very quickly.
All right, okay, I'll be very brief. I just think that in any issue related to women's rights, we need to look at it both perspectives, from left, right, and center, basically. You touched upon laws and amendment of laws as well. It's quite interesting because if we speak particularly on labor laws in the region, they have been quite progressed with certain, I would say, exceptions. But then that doesn't mean that the work on laws is done, because then there is another segment of law, family laws, for example, that still pressure women into roles and responsibilities that are extremely traditional. So what I'm trying to say is, of course, that you always have to look at it through a holistic perspective, and I do think that in many countries, in many parts of the world, and particularly the Arab states, the distinct bracket of the legal frameworks related to family laws is a critical one.
Oh, thank you very much. Maria Fernanda?
The situation in my country, Mexico, and in all of the world, especially in the global south, about gender violence, it's a lot. As we know, exists a lot of type of gender violence. And if we talk about especially in the decent work, women don't have decent works in Latin America. And that's true. We don't have the same economic situation that men, even if we have the same work. Especially, the problem in the labor market is the low participation of women in the director's position. Only 6% of CEOs in all countries are women. And that's a critical data. And most campaigns don't have gender parity in their position, including the low-level position and the highest position. So, what the laws we do, analyze and restructure the law, the public policy, but the most important, include all voices. Women from all reality, using an intersectionality perspective. It's not the same a white woman in Mexico than an indigenous woman in the south of the country. Are completely different realities. And it's completely different depending the country, depending the situation, the social and economic situation, depending if you go to the university, if you don't have the opportunity to go to the university. So to restructure the law, to restructure the public policy, we need to include all different realities. We need to include all women in all diversities, and in this way include children, youth, because women have our children and youth, our girls first. Empower girls and creating campaigns of public policy that include all voices and all perspectives is the best way to create a better situation for us. Listen all voices and position them in the analysis. It's the only way to make a change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tina from the private sector, private world.
Yeah, thank you. I echo the previous speakers before me, especially with regards to the collective, voice. It's really important to have representation. In many cases, representation is not so clear, so it's really important to have some leaders who can share the voice of women in the community. It's also important to address this stigma issue, corruption, weak labor market institutions. We need to create an enabling environment for women to access equal opportunities, access to finance, access to networks, access to information and knowledge, because in some countries they don't know where to go to get for help and support. So I think that's really key. And female perspectives is lacking when it comes to coming up with climate change solutions, and we need to bring more and more women's voices on the table, in particular decision-making processes. So we really need to invest in women. There are higher returns for society. Women, in many cases, they invest more in their families, more than men. We're seeing data on that. They employ more women, 2.5 times more than men. So there's a really good opportunity there in terms of job creation and economic development and social development and sustainability. So I think that's the last word for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to you, Kyra.
Yes, I would like to talk about the violence against women that was mentioning, and what Maria was just saying about this violence. We have to mention that today we have the 190 Convention on Violence from ILO, Violence and Harassment in the World War. That has been ratified by several countries in the region. I'm talking about America. The ratification of this convention and its promotion in the country has been part of the trade union struggle. We also need this convention to be a priority to think about how we respond to the climate crisis. We know that migrations resulting from climate change are already a reality, and that these migrations present enormous risk for women, risks of gender-based violence, trafficking, harassment, and death. We also know that jobs in renewable sectors are far from decent jobs or decent works. And from a gender perspective, we also need to ensure that we can apply Convention 190 not after, but before, during, and after these jobs are created. We have to talk about violence, and when we talk about violence against women, we have to talk about what kind of society we are living on. And when we are talking about what kind of society, we have to talk about what is the structure of the model that we are living on in our countries. We have to talk about democracy. We have to talk about participation and participation. We have to talk about education and changing different
Thank you, Kyra.
conductas.
Behaviors?
Yes, behaviors of people about how we face the violence and how we face it in all of the kind of works we have. We're talking about formal work, and we're talking about informal working. When we talk about informal working, the only way to face informal working is talking about what is the kind of model we are facing in our lives.
Thank you, Kyra.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bringing up the issue of violence and harassment in the world of work, and therefore also the link with just transition, which is something that also Mr. Garg mentioned in the initial speech. And therefore, 1 minute to you as well. Yeah, just if you want to conclude, if you have any remarks, just very briefly, because we are running out of time. You're okay? Okay, and then perhaps our colleague, Mr. Chandra.
So my last remark is that in many of the fossil fuel reasons, factories and mines close, and you will replace them with different economic activity. How do we bring gender aspect in economic diversification is going to be a very important aspect. And the second point is that there's a general sense that green job will be gender neutral. Okay, that's not going to be the case. The green job of the future will be very technocentric. You will require people with a lot of technical skill to get those green jobs, whether in renewable energy sector, electric vehicle sector, or any other sector. And one of the problem of education system in many countries is that science and mathematics is not supposed to be for women. There's a very clear, if you are a woman, you go to social science, and science is for boys. So green jobs also, unless and until there is a fundamental understanding of what kind of skill is required for green job, you will again have gender issues, big disparity between men and women in the future green job. That also has to be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will leave the closing remarks to the resident coordinator, the UN resident coordinator in Egypt, Mrs. Elena Ponova.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm not going, to make an attempt to summarize this very rich and inspiring discussion. I will just offer two reflections on both panels. The first one was about just transition and gender. And here, I will speak with my head of United Nations resident coordinator. And what's the role of the UN overall in Egypt and also in other country offices. Important here is the word just, and very core to the mandate of the United Nations is to actually unpack the word just. And when we start unpacking the word just, and this is all what we've heard, we will of course, come to gender and to what extent just is gender responsive. Because if it is gender blind, if it is not gender responsive, it's not just. And it's to a great extent the role of the UN agencies. That's why I was very happy that at the first panel we had 3 UN agencies talking to work with all the partners and to make sure that as we move to transition, because transition will happen, and it will happen in an accelerated mode. So we need to be very well equipped. We need to be, sure that the people are aware of what's coming. And we need to make sure that they are with us, that skilling happens, upskilling happens, requalification happens, because many things will, be changed. The big ticket item will be renewable energy, so just energy transition, and there women may not find sufficient decent jobs, because if you look into the sector, it's more males that will be engaged. So we need to make sure women are empowered so that they can find decent jobs in this new world that is coming our way. And second reflection will be definitely on the partnerships. And also one thing which is important, and again, I'm very glad that the panel was focused on the country level, because this is where, the rubber hits the road. This is where the climate action will happen. And talking about the country level, I think one thing that will be important is that we forge the partnerships. We work with all of you together. There is space for everybody, because the change will be huge. And we need to be there by the side of the government, by the side of the partners, by the side of the people and women, so that we make the best for the people, and we make sure that again, going back to just, it's a just that benefits the women and all, you know, the rest of the most vulnerable. So thanks a lot once again for this opportunity. Very, you know, great, inspirational panel members, and big thank you to you for staying, you know, with us till the end.
Thank you very much. A big applause. And we wish you a very pleasant evening in Sharm el Sheikh.